exactly is wrong with economic inequality? Now, F. Scott Fitzgerald, I think, is probably this country's most acute observer of the rich. You may have heard one of his frequently quoted statements, "The rich are different from you and me." It's from a short story called The Rich Boy that was published in 1926, and here's the entire passage. "Let me tell you about the very rich. They are different from you and me. They possess and enjoy early, and it does something to them. Makes them soft where we are hard, and cynical where we are trustful, in a way that, unless you were born rich, it is very difficult to understand. They think deep in their hearts that they are better than we are, because we had to discover the compensations and refuges of life for ourselves. Even when they enter deep into our world or sink below us, they still think that they are better than we are. They are different." Now, you may also have heard Ernest Hemingway's equally famous retort to Fitzgerald, published many years later. Quote, "Scott said the rich are different from you and me. Yes, they have more money." Now, it seems to me that our attitudes about economic inequality can be summed up in these two quotes. Fitzgerald is warning us that there are some very worrisome things attached to great wealth, issues of morality and community. The rich think they're better, but we live in a society based on the belief that everyone has equal rights, equal opportunity, equal value. There may be a problem. Hemingway, on the other hand, is saying basically, so what? Who cares if someone has more money? It doesn't mean they're better than me. It doesn't mean they're smarter or better looking or can write a better novel. It certainly doesn't mean they're happier or have a more satisfying life. Maybe the opposite. Who cares if they think they're superior? Stop worrying about it. Now, many people think Hemingway had the last word in this exchange. His answer is very appealing. I think it's very American. We shouldn't value people based on their wealth. We shouldn't look up to them. We shouldn't deify them like European kings and queens. That's what America's all about. It's why we had a revolution. No more aristocracy. No more oligarchy. So which is it? Fitzgerald, Hemingway? I've thought a lot about this in recent years. I really started thinking hard about it when the recession hit. What happened and who or what was responsible? And the conclusion of my thinking is this. Before the recession, I would say I saw things like Hemingway. But now I'm much closer to Fitzgerald's view. Before, my thinking was I didn't care all that much about wealth and what it could buy. I cared a lot about people who were poor and how to get them out of poverty. But I didn't really think that some people getting very rich was damaging to that goal or to me or to our society. Maybe it was even a good thing if in the process they innovated and improved and created new sources of wealth. But now I think I was wrong. Now I think that the growth of a rich and super rich class poses real dangers to our country. Above all, and this is what I want to speak about now, I think it threatens our shared sense of community and the moral fabric of our society. Let me explain why I think this. Now, I don't want to bombard you with numbers, but we need to start with a few facts. Now, Fitzgerald made his observation about the very rich in the middle of the roaring 20s. And that's interesting because when you look at economic inequality in the United States, it turns out that where we are today looks a lot like the 1920s. The two peaks of income inequality in the last 100 years were in the late 1920s and today. In 1929, just before the crash that ushered in the Great Depression, the wealthiest 1% of Americans took home about 24% of the total income of the U.S., just about a quarter. And just before the recent recession hit in 2007, the share going to the wealthiest 1%, once again, was about 24%. Now, the important story is what happened in between. By now, I expect many of you have seen some version of the charts that illustrate this trend. A graph that showed the share of U.S. income going to the 1% looks like a big U. After its peak in 1929, it started to drop. It dropped during the Great Depression, as many of the rich lost their fortunes. And during World War II, when employment surged and tax rates were raised to fund the war. And during the post-war economic boom of the 50s and 60s, when strong unions helped create high-paying jobs for working Americans. For most of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the share of income going to the 1% had dropped from the 24% it was in the 20s to about 9 or 10% of total U.S. income. But then in the 1980s, things started to change. Inequality began to rise steeply. It continued to rise in the 90s and 2000s, with some brief downturns like when the tech bubble burst in the late 90s, until just before 2000, the recession, when, as we saw, a return to the levels of the 1920s. But while the Great Depression reduced inequality by wiping out much of the wealth of America's 1%, the Great Recession that we've suffered through now has not. After a brief drop, the share of income going to the 1% has returned to pre-recession levels. In fact, virtually all of the so-called recovery from the recession has benefited just the 1%. To illustrate, in 2009, before any sort of recovery had really taken effect, the average annual income for the 1% was $871,000 per year. A few years later, 2012, 2013, it had risen to $968,000, a jump of over 10% in just 4 years. But for the rest of us, the 99%, income during the same period didn't go up at all. In fact, during the same period, the average income for the 99% fell from $44,000 a year to $43,000. Now, what do these numbers mean? What's the difference between an economy where for decade after decade, the top 1% capture 9 or 10% of national income, like was true from the 1940s through the 70s, and one where for decade after decade they take 15 or 20 or 25%? It's a complicated question, but there is no question that for most Americans, the period from the 40s through the 70s was far superior in economic terms to the decade since. During this time, the United States had strong growth, averaging about 2% a year, that was evenly distributed, a rising tide that really did lift all boats. The rich got richer, but so did the middle class, so did the poor. As our productivity went up and the economy grew, the growth benefited everyone. But in the decades since, from the 1980s till now, it's been a very different story. Growth has slowed, but more importantly, the benefits of growth have gone mostly to the haves. The gains in economic productivity of the 80s, 90s, and 2000s have gone to the top 20% and especially to the top 1% and even the top 0.01%. And inequality has skyrocketed. Here's an illustration. In 1965, 50 years ago, the CEO of a Fortune 500 company made about 20 times as much as the average worker in that company. Today, he or she makes almost 300 times as much. Now, these were the basic facts I learned when I began to look into this, and I can tell you, as I discovered these things, I was shocked and frightened. Was this just going to keep going and going? How far? What was happening to my country? Now, as often happens when you get bad news, my first reaction was denial. Like many Americans, I thought, well, maybe we are getting more unequal, but what really matters is economic mobility. The American dream is that anyone can be rich and successful if they get an education and they work hard. It doesn't matter that much if the gap between rich and poor has widened, if someone who was born near the bottom can still get to the top. But when I looked into this, I became more alarmed, because at the same time that inequality has increased, moving up the economic ladder has become harder. In fact, it turns out that the greater the level of inequality in a country or a region, the harder it is for children from poor families to improve their economic status compared to their parents. And this is why today you have a better chance of achieving the American dream in Canada or Denmark than you do in the USA. Within the US, I should add, your chances are worse in the South than in the Northeast or the West. A few years ago, the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, Alan Krueger, he gave a name to the graph that shows this relationship between the rise in inequality and the increasing difficulty of rising up from poverty. He called it the Great Gatsby Curve. And this may be why in 1998, a poll showed 2/3 of Americans said the economic system in the U.S. was basically fair, but 15 years later, in 2013, only 50% thought it was fair. Or as my favorite billionaire, Warren Buffett, said a few years back, there's been class warfare going on for the last 20 years, and my class has won. So I was faced with the question, what kind of world is this? What's it doing to us? What troubled me most was something I felt more than thought, something that hit me in the gut, not the head. It's that we're in danger of losing our sense of community, losing our belief that we're in this together. The lived experience of many Americans no longer supports that belief. Now, for instance, when I was a kid growing up, I went to a lot of baseball games in Chicago. And at the game, everyone knew where the big shots sat, right? The guy who owned the team, the Comiskey family, his rich buddies, they had seats right on the field, close to the dugout, where you could see them and wave at them. And if you had the nerve, you could go right up to them and say hi and give them a piece of your mind about what was wrong with that year's version of the White Sox. But today, that's not where the owner sits. Today, he and his posse are up in a skybox behind darkened windows, looking down, literally, on the rest of us. The skybox is a great symbol of the increasing distance that the rich have put between themselves and the general population. More and more, the lives of the very rich and even the sort of rich don't intersect with the less well-off. The rich send their kids to different schools, live in their own gated communities, and vacation at exclusive resorts. Increasingly, the rich and poor in America occupy separate zip codes. We have zones of concentrated poverty, zones of concentrated wealth. Look at what's happening these days in places like Manhattan and San Francisco, our great cities. These used to be vibrant melting pots. They've increasingly turning into theme parks for the ultra-rich from all over the world. Too expensive to live in, not just for the people who cut the lawns and fix the plumbing, but for artists and entrepreneurs and inventors, the people who made those cities worth living in, including for the rich themselves. This geographic distance adds to the social distance that comes with large gaps in wealth. To make it easier, I think, for both rich and poor to accept Fitzgerald's judgment, the rich are different, and their success is evidence to them of superior talent or drive or intelligence. And unlike the jobs and prosperity that are supposed to trickle down from the rich to the rest of us, this belief is trickling down. Of all the people in the world, polls show that Americans are among the most likely to believe that being rich is evidence of individual merit, rather than luck or fate or government help or having the right parents. And the flip side is that being poor is often seen as evidence of inferiority, not working hard enough, not being smart enough, not having enough self-control. And that's why, ironically, the wealthier you are, the more likely you are to oppose programs to help the poor, because you think this help will be wasted or make the poor lazier. Now, there's a name for the type of society where wealth is the measure of all things. It's called oligarchy. It may seem a bit far-fetched to worry that the United States is becoming an oligarchy, but I worry that it's happening, almost without our being aware. Think about the way that the language of markets has penetrated our consciousness. It's happened in sports, where we often compare the salaries of players instead of how many home runs they hit. Or movies, where reviewers discuss the box office earnings before they talk about the acting. Or politics, where we've become used to handicapping campaigns by looking at how much money each candidate has raised and which billionaire donors they've attracted. In the history of mankind, oligarchy has not been the exception. It's been the norm, the default. In much of the world today, in Russia, most of Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, it still is. We should not imagine that it can't happen here. There's a moral philosopher who I admire a lot named Michael Sandel, who calls this trend, this way of looking at the world that sees it as a function of market forces, that sees the verdict of the markets as proper and just. He calls it market fundamentalism. And it's, to me, what makes economic inequality so dangerous. Because the more important we make the market, the more powerful wealth becomes. The more that art and leisure, politics and education become monetized, the more money matters and the more influence flows to the wealthy. As I grappled with this question of inequality, I became convinced that perhaps the biggest change in America in my lifetime has been the widespread acceptance of this idea of market fundamentalism, this belief that markets are the measure of all things. It's become the baseline accepted view of the world for many Americans, not just for billionaires and hedge fund tycoons, but for office managers and fast food workers and people on the assembly line. As you know, the most effective way to wield power is to get your victims to internalize their own inferiority. In the past, when you could convince blacks or women or the low-born that they were inferior, when they believed it themselves, you hardly needed to use force to maintain control. Once we believe that income and wealth grant the rich a right to rule, or that challenging the verdict of the market is not just difficult but immoral, that money is speech and corporations are people, then, as Warren Buffett told us, the war is over. Now, what does living in this world of greater and greater inequality do to us? What happens to our communities? Some say nothing, because even if the 1% are taking most of the gains from increasing productivity, aren't the rest of us still benefiting from better medicines and faster computers and cheaper plane tickets? Don't we have the internet, smartphones, Facebook? We do. But I think this ignores what matters to human beings. We don't gauge our well-being by some kind of absolute measure, but by how we're doing compared to others. In fact, one of the most surprising things I discovered about economic inequality is that it negatively affects so many seemingly unrelated aspects of life: mental health, violent crime, educational achievement, obesity, teen pregnancy. There's a powerful study called The Spirit Level: Why Greater Equality Makes Society Stronger, that looks at the relationship between inequality and all these issues and concludes that inequality always makes them worse. Countries that have higher levels of inequality do worse across the board. Disturbingly, when you compare countries on these health and social indicators, the United States is by far the lowest ranked of all the major industrial states, and it also has by far the highest level of economic inequality. Why is this? It's not self-evident that inequality would make people more violent or more prone to mental illness, but the Spirit Level argues convincingly, I think, that these are side effects of the erosion of trust and social cohesion that I described before. More egalitarian societies exhibit more trust of neighbors and fellow citizens, more trust of government and other institutions. I don't need to tell you that in America, our trust in government and each other has been plummeting, while the intensity of our political disagreements has been rising, at just the same time that economic inequality has skyrocketed. At this point in my journey, I was convinced that we urgently needed to stop the growth in inequality, but is that possible? Didn't I quote Warren Buffett earlier telling us that the class war was over? Don't learned economists tell us that the rise in inequality is the result of great global and historical changes like the rise of China and automation and artificial intelligence that are hollowing out the middle class, and there isn't anything we can do about it. But I don't think that things are hopeless. 1,000 times no. Because I don't agree that the rise of inequality is beyond our capacity to change. What we need to do is accept that this is not just an economic or even a political challenge, but a moral and a spiritual one. We need to see it as a threat not just to our pocketbooks, but to our moral fabric and our ability to live in community with one another. To make this happen, we have to recover our faith in human agency and our ability to act together. Market fundamentalism is just one more example of ideologies that throughout history have been created and fostered to make people believe that the way things are, however unequal, however unjust, is ordained and cannot be changed. Whether this is seen as coming from God or fate or history or nature or the market, the purpose is the same: to convince the have-nots to accept the order of things. There are strong headwinds to fight against. Workers in the developing world are competing for our jobs. Robots are making unskilled labor more redundant. It takes more education and training and skill to move up the economic ladder. But the strongest headwind comes from our own beliefs and our own values. Change those, I am convinced, and we can deal with everything else. There's no shortage of programs and policies to make our economy fairer or to help people at the bottom get educated and trained so they can move up. What we lack is the will and the vision to implement them. The next steps there, I think, are up to us. As Peter Morales, the head of the Unitarian Universalist Association, said in 2011, economic inequality pollutes human relationships the way smog pollutes our lungs. Just look at life where the gaps between rich and poor are greatest, Latin America and Africa, and look back to when the gap was greatest in American history. These were times of slavery and robber barons. At great sacrifice and cost, Americans overthrew slavery and tamed the robber barons. These victories started with changes in our understanding of right and wrong, and in our view of what we owed one another if we were to live in community. That slavery was not part of the natural order of things. It could be abolished. That robber barons were not masters of the universe, but predators who we had the right to rein in with laws and regulations. We have risen to this challenge before. We can now. Fitzgerald may have had it partially right. The very rich are different. Perhaps it's more accurate to say that they often convince themselves, sometimes the rest of us, that they're different. That they're the makers and the rest of us are takers. But we have it in our power to give Hemingway the last laugh. Yes, they have more money. Somebody will always have more money. But we know that every human being has inherent worth and dignity. Everyone. Let us go forward together.